In this video, I'm going to take you on a guided tour around the fascinating Martin B-57 Canberra. We'll walk around the exterior, have a look in here, and then jump over and into the cockpit and explore this piece of aviation history together. Now before we get into the tour, can I just say that as a foreigner from Australia, how incredibly hospitable and friendly these American museums have been. Here, the team at the Strategic Air Command and Aerospace Museum near Omaha in Nebraska were using a forklift to open the canopy so that I could film inside and share it all with you. Now there is so much negativity in the cesspit that is formerly known as Twitter and Facebook, but as an Australian, all I can say is that every American I met on these museum trips has been incredibly generous and friendly. Now on with the video. While I do hope to do a separate video on the English Electric Canberra when I can find one to film inside of, I still have to mention it in this video as you can't appreciate the B-57 without knowing about the British jet on which it was based, and I'll be referring to both versions as we walk around this one today. So first with the Canberra, which really was from an era when the British were at the forefront of aviation. The same year that the war in the Pacific ended, in 1945, the British Ministry of Supply issued specification B345, asking for a two-seat, high-altitude medium bomber that could drop a bomb blind just using a radar system. English Electric received the contract to build 4 aircraft, originally called the A1. Development was delayed due to the new jet engines, and the maiden flight took place in 1949 of what became known as the Canberra. Now let's jump to the American version, the Martin B-57, which was officially called the Intruder, but the name never really stuck, as the public preferred the Canberra name, which by the way was the capital city of Australia. English Electric hoped that the Aussie reference might help their chances of selling it to the Royal Australian Air Force, who did go on to buy it and locally manufacture it. In fact, here's one flying at an air show in 2025, although this was actually an old RAF jet painted in Australian colours, but we'll put that to an aside. Now back to the Americans. A tactical jet bomber and interdiction aircraft was required as all they had was the Douglas B-26 Invader. That was developed during World War II, was piston-powered and a generation old. It also wasn't suitable for night missions, which was when a lot of the enemy equipment would be moved, under the cover of darkness. Replacements considered were the North American B-45 Tornado, although this had quite a poor bomb load. There was also the AJ-1 Savage, which was a carrier-based hybrid of 2 piston engines and a single turbojet in the rear fuselage. The Avro Canada CF-100 Canuck, which was a large interceptor but considered to be easily converted into a bombing role, or the futuristic and 3-engined Martin XB-51. The latter was unsuitable because it only ever remained a prototype, and frankly it was pretty advanced, so there's no doubt that there would have been delays in its development, and the Air Force were increasingly desperate to get the jet as soon as possible. It probably wouldn't have had the fuel load to loiter over supply routes either, and wasn't especially nimble for the low-flying role. On the 21st of February 1951, the Canberra was the first jet aircraft to fly non-stop across the Atlantic Ocean, and later that week, it took part in a fly-off with several of the alternative aircraft where it was vastly superior. There was opposition to using a foreign jet, and English Electric were flat out building so many of them for themselves, so in 1951, they signed a deal with Martin to produce the Canberra under license in North America. On the 20th of July 1953, the first US-built production aircraft conducted its maiden flight. The B-57A was mostly the same as the British example because, as I said before, the Air Force were keen for it to enter service as soon as possible. The B-57B was a more significant upgrade, with one of the most significant being the installation of a fighter-style canopy, with a flat panel windscreen and a tandem seating arrangement. This improved visibility and also allowed for it to be fitted with a gun sight. Crew would now enter via the canopy, so the glazed bombing nose and starboard crew entrance hatches were deleted. The B-57C and the B-57E were dual-control versions that could be used in combat, pilot training, and also used to tow targets. And that's this, the E model that we're looking at today, but as I walk around, I'll mention the other versions as well. Starting at the nose, and you can see that this has the tandem layout and the fighter-style clamshell canopy with the flat front glass for the targeting system introduced on the B-57B model. But jumping back across the Atlantic Ocean, and the original Canberra had a goldfish bowl canopy for the pilot, while the navigator and the bombardier sat side by side in a rear compartment, and they had their own small windows, as you can see here. They would all enter via this hatch here. The production Canberra B2 version had a glazed nose, and the bombardier would crawl up into this and use the optical bomb sight. As I said before, the plan was for blind bombing, where the targeting would be wholly controlled by the radar system, although that system was delayed, so they had to bring back the bombardier crew member and install an optical bomb sight. The fishbowl design was fine for high altitudes, but an interesting point was that they had quite a basic air conditioning system. At high altitudes, the crew within the fuselage would be very cold, but the pilot would have some warmth from being within the fishbowl. But on the ground, the pilot would be cooking, and apparently there was a time limit where they would need to be in the air, otherwise they'd have to return to the ramp and cool down with specially designed sunshades and movable blowers. The RAF installed ventilated flight suits, and those worked apparently fairly well. The later models have improved air conditioning systems, and the clamshell canopy could be raised to allow in some cooling air, including when it was still taxiing, but it remained a problem for both the Martin and the English versions. The other issues with the English fishbowl was that it was not appropriate for low-level targeting, as remember that this was used in an interdiction role where bullets and rockets would be fired at the ground, so the British created the BI-8 version, which had a clamshell canopy hinged at the rear but offset to the left, while the nav sat further back within the fuselage and towards the right-hand side. He also lost his ejection seat and was expected to jump from the entry hatch during an emergency. But otherwise the English Canberras stuck with the fishbowl, including the B57A, which you might recall I said at the start, was rushed into production and they simply didn't have time for any major changes like what came afterwards. But the Americans did want to make changes, although they had to wait until the B57B, as the clamshell canopy would provide for better pilot aiming, and having the second crew member here provided another pair of eyes, and it was also easier to fit the ejection seats. There was an equipment hatch, and importantly, this here was the external power receptacle where the ground power unit could attach. Without ground power, the onboard batteries could light up the instruments, but they were not powerful enough to start the engines, and I'll mention those explosive cartridges a little later. It had a regular tricycle landing gear layout, and that was hydraulically actuated, and the twin-wheeled nose gear was free castering with no control from the pilot, so steering was controlled through differential braking. Keeping the lower fuselage free for the weapons bay, the main gear was moved to the side and attached underneath the wing. By looking back at the weapons bay again, and I need to point out one of the most significant changes from the English to the American B-57B. Loading the ordnance was always a challenge due to how low it was to the ground. This allowed for a smaller landing gear, which required less room when folded up into the fuselage, but it certainly did not help the crew trying to squeeze in underneath. With the B-57B model, they installed a rotating door originally designed for the XB-51, and the bombs were directly attached to that. This could all be prepared before the aircraft had even returned from a mission, and they could simply swap the doors. It also generated a lot less drag than regular doors when opening, and was much faster. One helpful upgrade by Martin was adding the ability to extend the main landing gear by several inches on the ground to aid the bomb loading. And here's the main landing gear again, and it was a single large tyre which allowed it to operate from poorly maintained runways. There was always a concern that the enemy could destroy the runways immediately at the start of a conflict, so the aircraft might then have to operate from gravel or even grass. This is the same reason why the TSR-2 had such large tyres. I contrast this with American jets such as the B-58 Hustler with relatively small tyres, as they were planning on operating from smooth undamaged runways that were a long way from the USSR. And now yes, I know that Alaska is close to Russia, but most US bases were much further away. It's always interesting to consider how the geographical differences between the US and the UK and how that affects the aircraft design. Let's move on and talk about the engines. The first Canberra was fitted with Rolls-Royce Avons, but due to concerns about the design delays, the second prototype was fitted with centrifugal flow Rolls-Royce Neens, which had significantly larger nacelles, as you can see here, and this was a backup plan in case the Avon program failed. But axial flow engines were the future, the Avon development continued, and there was only ever one Neen-powered Canberra assembled. If you look closely, you will have noticed the Spectre rocket motors firing here, although that was never intended for this aircraft, and these flights were instead used to test the rockets for other applications. Positioned in a nacelle within each wing, similar to the Gloucester Meteor, this was not ideal for the wing spar, and uncontained explosions could damage the wing structure. But it did raise the engines up higher, as opposed to having them positioned in under-wing pods, keeping them further away from foreign objects that could be sucked up from poorly prepared runways. And it also allowed the whole aircraft to sit lower, closer to the ground, and as I mentioned before, have shorter landing gears. The lower height also improved serviceability on the ground. Well, to an extent, except when it was too low to the ground that the crew could struggle to fit underneath. The engines were started with pyrotechnic cartridges, which were initially quite dramatic, and here museum volunteer Ellen opens it up to show me where the cartridge would be installed. Apparently cockpits would fill with smoke if the ground crew did not follow their protocols, and there were stories of onlookers pulling out the fire hoses, assuming that the aircraft had actually caught fire. Later English and Australian Canberras moved to a triple cartridge system, so if the engine did not ignite, the pilot would simply fire a second cartridge instead of needing the ground crew to insert another one, but they weren't fitted to the Martin versions. Later versions did use smokeless cartridges, and later B-57s with different engines were upgraded to electric starters. The Martin B-57 version was instead powered by Wright J65 engines producing 7,220 pounds each. There were actually license-built versions of the British Armstrong Siddeley Sapphire turbojets. The nacelles were larger up front to handle the Sapphires, and there was also a distinctive scoop for cooling air beneath the main engine intake. Originally, engine production was subcontracted to the Buick division of General Motors, with the engines designated the J65 BW5, but the Buick engines did not prove satisfactory and production reverted to Wright. Now, not that I'm a biased Ford man or anything, but maybe they should have outsourced to Ford instead, because we all know that their engine design is near perfection, as demonstrated on my old Falcon XR8. Of interest, and I'll mention again later, but the WB-57F had additional detachable Pratt & Whitney J60 turbojets further out on the wings for use at high altitude. As we walk along the wing's trailing edge, let's take a step back and talk about it in more detail. English Electric did consider a swept wing design, as they were aware of the German work during World War II, and it would improve the aircraft's high-speed performance. But remember that high altitude was also important, and that's where the straight wing design performs well. Compare that with the Lockheed U-2 and even the more modern RQ-4 Global Hawks and Northrop Tassard Blue, which all share a straight wing design. Martin did consider modifying the wings to give them a sweep back and a T-tail similar to the XB-51, but the US Air Force were pushing the program along as they desperately needed it in the skies, so Martin had to keep much of the English Electric design, at least initially. The wings also had an especially large chord, which is the length from the trailing up to the leading edges, which again helped with high altitude performance and had the added benefit of allowing for more internal room for fuel storage. While the wing and engines enabled it to safely fly up and above adversary jets, the second generation of jet fighters were now getting close, so the wing on the English PR9 series was stretched 3 feet and 10 inches. On the 18th of February 1956, a test pilot climbed to 18,300 meters, which is 60,000 feet. It was incredible to think that just a few years beforehand, the B-29 maxed out at 30,000 feet, and it helps you understand why the Air Force rejected Boeing's B-54 program, as it really was a whole generation behind these new jets. Along the wing's trailing edge were these flaps, which are best seen in this footage from an air show in Australia. You'll notice that there are multiple holes, and these were to reduce its overall weight. This example is also missing the wingtip fuel tank, and some even had another bomb attached here, such as the Royal Australian Air Force Canberras. These tip tanks carried around 300 US gallons of fuel and improved their range, in addition to the wet wing design where fuel moved around freely within the wing's liquid-proof structure. By allowing the fuel to flow freely around it, it saves the weight of having separate tanks within the wing structure, although obviously they need to ensure that there were no leaks, so engineers put the wings through multiple different flex tests to ensure their integrity. This red device here is a wing vent mast, where fuel can be ejected from. The wing tanks had minimal expansion space, so fuel will be vented out through here to avoid excessive pressure. There were these pop-up and pop-down finger-type air brakes above and below the wing, as you can see here. Although they were never that effective, in fact crews would otherwise open the bomb bay doors in the English version to lower their altitude. But walking back and past the engine's exhaust outlet, and you can see this structure here, with warning signs, and that was a hydraulically actuated dive brake that could be deployed to avoid overspeeding as these aircraft dive down to fire at enemy troops below. Here's footage of that used in action. Now we'll mention the armament. While the English version, including the B-57A, did not have guns as it was always planned for a high altitude role, but with the US looking at using it in a low altitude tactical bombing and interdiction role, they were added with the B model. They weren't required on this E model, but underneath these caps, you would have had two M39 20mm cannons with 290 rounds per gun. These replaced 50 cal Browning machine guns on earlier B-57Bs. They could be used for strafing attacks, flying low over enemy supply corridors and taking out anything that moved. The B-57 had 4 external hardpoints per wing, more than the English Electric version, and they could carry 2,800 pounds of ordnance. The outer 2 were only for light stores like rockets, as you can see here in this photo. They could also carry napalm tanks, as you can see on this example at the USAF Museum in Dayton. As I mentioned before, the Aussies replaced the wingtip tank with another bomb, presumably because they had to fight off crocodiles and other deadly snakes in their own bases, as well as the Viet Cong. Inside the weapons bay, they could carry 4,500 pounds of bombs, including a nuclear weapon. Now let's talk more about this E model. You may recall amusing stories where newer and much faster jets would struggle to connect with the aerial tanker KC-97s because their stall speed was around the same as the older piston tanker's cruising speed. Well, the same discrepancy was a problem for pilot target training. The B-29s were used to tow targets, but they were so slow that it was just not realistic, so the idea of using a B-57 was raised. Early testing was promising as they had already established that the Canberra was a reliable aircraft. They were fast, and they had adequate stores in the weapons bays for the target reel. Further testing was shown that the engines were powerful enough to provide for the reeling mechanism in addition to the high speed flying. The bomb door was fitted with 4 tow reels, which could also quickly be removed, and it could be converted back to a regular tactical bomber if needed. Armour was fitted underneath the aircraft to protect it from a snapped cable hitting the underside. They've been removed from this example, but canisters would be attached to store the targets. There were also a few reinforcements required in the fuselage to bear the additional tow system load. The targets would be released from the canisters and then moved away from the aircraft via a long wire that was stored in the weapons bay I mentioned just before. Now, to help avoid shooting down the wrong aircraft, and while that does sound obvious, it's much harder in the air, so the B-57E was painted orange on top and fitted with twin strobes to help differentiate them from the target. Looking at the tail, and we see quite a large rudder. In fact, it's so large that it's the only control surface that required hydraulic support. The portside elevators on the horizontal stabilizers and the ailerons on the wing's trailing edges all had much smaller spring tabs that could move in the opposite direction to the control surface to reduce the pilot's effort while maintaining conventional control surface feel. Now, a really important point that I have to mention is the modular design, where the aircraft was divided into 5 separate structures. There was the front, the center, and the rear fuselage, and then the wings were just simply bolted on, with 2 bolts per wing with the English version, while the Americans used 4 bolts. The sections could be manufactured separately and then attached together at the end. It also allowed for easy modification for different roles, and it was this simplicity and versatility that meant that it could quite literally still fly now in 2026. Now, first looking at it with the canopy closed, and you can really understand why it would have been so hot in direct sunlight, because it really is like a greenhouse. Now let's look back again with the canopy having been raised by the forklift. While it's a bit of a stretch of the legs to get inside, it still looks much easier than entering through the hatch on the English Electric version and the B-57A. And importantly, in an emergency, this would have been much easier to get out of. As I clamber in, just a reminder that if you enjoy these types of videos, then please give this video a thumbs up, press the hype button if that's an option, and comment below. Those simple steps show YouTube that you like these types of videos, so they show you more of them, and it also supports my channel. With more views and subscribers, I can afford to fly around, film more of these, and spend hours editing them. That's enough of me rabbiting on about myself and my channel, and back to this incredible B-57. Starting here on the left, and I'll point out the emergency canopy release. It would have been too heavy for the crew to lift it if the hydraulic systems failed, so they would pull this system, which would then activate the explosive devices to blow the canopy upwards. Now, this was half of the ejection system, but obviously not include the seat as they were already on the ground. Having said that, it was fitted with regular ejection seats, and they could be activated by this lever here. Swinging back for a second, and you'll see mention of a special weapon, which of course refers to a nuclear bomb. Both the English Electric versions and the American B-57s carried atomic bombs, and with the latter launching them via the toss bombing technique. They would angle the aircraft upwards, and the weapon system would release automatically, tossing the bomb forward in an upward trajectory, while the B-57 would then fly up and over itself, rolling back upright and flying off in the opposite direction as fast as possible. I couldn't find any B-57 footage of this happening, but here is incredible footage of the B-47 Stratojet performing this maneuver, and it's really incredible. If you're familiar with that aircraft and how large it is, it's amazing seeing it flip up over backwards in this footage just like a fighter jet. It must have been an experience for the poor bombardier in the nose without a window. This lever here is connected with a hydraulic system that powers the landing gear, the brakes, the gear doors, the wing flaps, the canopy latch, dive brakes, and the rudder that I mentioned before. The system is powered by separate pumps powered by each engine, but if they fail, there is a lever here that can be moved vigorously to build hydraulic pressure. As this is just a last resort during emergencies, the full handle was usually stowed away down near their leg. A handle could also be inserted externally to generate hydraulic pressure to raise the canopy once on the ground by the ground crew. Moving forward, and we have the two throttles for the two engines. This here is a microphone button, and this is the dive or air brake switch that you saw on the wings and on the rear of the fuselage. Behind those were the jettison controls for the tip tanks, and that could be done in an emergency to improve their range after being used up. This would jettison the targets that could be towed behind it, potentially as they've been blown up by a surface-to-air missile, and you wouldn't want to land with this long cable trailing behind with a smouldering piece of metal on the end. Up here is the canopy controls, including a warning light if it was only slightly ajar. Now as it opens at the front, it would be possible to be slightly open but appear closed, and you wouldn't notice until you had picked up enough speed to blow it up and off, and that would be less than ideal, so this was here to warn against that. Moving up and above, and you'll recall me mentioning the flat piece of glass installed in the front because the rounded window would interfere with the gun sight that is sitting here. This shark-shaped display is the APS-54 radar warning indicator that would warn of adversary radars that could be potentially detecting your presence. Looking down at the main display, and you've got the Mach meter over here. This had a max speed of 580 miles an hour at 40,000 feet, which is around Mach 0.88. Although the cruise speed was around 475 miles an hour. This here is an altimeter going up to 9, which is 90,000 feet. The English Electric Canberra set multiple altitude records, with the first being in 1953 when a modified version with Rolls-Royce Olympus engines reached 63,668 feet. On April 1955, it reached 65,000 feet, and in 1957 it reached an incredible 70,310 feet with the assistance of Napier double Scorpion rockets. You have the total fuel amount, and in this panel down here is the specific fuel movements that I'll show you shortly. Here on the right are displays for various engine parameters for both engines: the engine tachometer, the exhaust speed, the fuel flow, and the oil pressure. Now it's really special looking at the yoke here and seeing B-57. I really was living the AvGeek stream on that day, having also sat inside a B-58 and an FB-111A, and those two videos are also on my channel. On the left was a microphone button, while on the right, the red button was to release the bombs or the rockets, behind it was a gun trigger, and this round switch here was to adjust the trim. Looking in under here, and you can see the mention of the different tanks and their capabilities. There were two large tanks within the fuselage, one in each wing, and the tip tanks. A ferry tank could be attached to the rotating weapons bay door too. Here on the right is the switch to fire the cartridges and start engine number 1 and engine number 2. Here's the electrical generator control panel. In addition to the battery, there are 4 generators being powered by the 2 engines, so they generate so much heat that they actually have to have their own inlet underneath the engine for cooling air. Further down, near the red warning sign, are controls for the cabin pressurization, and you may recall me mentioning that it was upgraded in the B57B so the poor crew would not cook prior to gaining altitude, where the outside temperature was well below freezing. Another interesting change from the English to the American version was storing oxygen as a liquid rather than gas, which was meant to save weight, and it did, but then it required much more complex equipment on the ground to refill it in its liquid form, while in the English version you could simply swap out the tanks. There's more navigation and communication systems further back on the right hand side panel. Let's stand up and check out the seat behind. And while standing, you'll spot the yellow ejection handles again for the ejection seat. The seats on the Martin Canberras initially were the Aircraft Mechanics Incorporated ejection seat, and in the 1970s these were upgraded to Douglas seats. The G and the F production aircraft had the Douglas escape hatch seats from the start. The back seat on the regular B-57Bs would have been for the navigator, while on this E model it was the tow target operator's position. Their survivability was now much higher in the tandem layout than with the previous position within the fuselage. As you may recall, some crew were required to jump out of the entry door, which was not ideal as the plane could be disintegrating in flight. The guy back here would have had to help navigate the aircraft and coordinate the rolling out of targets and releasing them. Another version deserves a mention, and it's the RB-57D on display here in Dayton, Ohio. This was developed to provide high-altitude reconnaissance as a Lockheed U-2 program was delayed. It had a new nose section with a single pilot and a whole array of reconnaissance equipment. The wingspan was lengthened to 106 feet, which was 42 feet more than the B-57B. The chord was also increased, improving lift, and also provided more room for fuel storage, as the fuselage fuel tanks were removed to fit in all of the spy equipment. Here's footage of it flying next to the regular B-57B, and it really highlights the differences. The engines were also upgraded with more powerful Pratt & Whitney J57 turbojets, which were used in the Lockheed U-2, the Boeing 707, and even the B-52 Stratofortress. This commonality made maintenance and spare parts much easier. On December 11, 1956, 3 RB-57Ds overflew Vladivostok in the USSR during broad daylight. Above the range of Soviet fighters, and just before the arrival of the SA-2 SAM missiles, this caused an uproar and President Dwight D. Eisenhower agreed to end military overflights of the USSR. It's worth noting though that later U-2 flights were operated by the CIA and not the military, so you can tell that agreement was written by lawyers. The RB-57D continued recon flights, although they would just skirt along the borders of the USSR, but could still peer in using their sideways-looking cameras. Here is one collecting atmospheric data during the Juniper nuclear bomb tests in Bikini Atoll in 1958. Its luck did eventually run out in 1959 when one, operated by the Republic of China Air Force, which is Taiwan, became the first enemy aircraft shot down by a surface-to-air missile over mainland China. They were eventually retired due to metal fatigue, and the Lockheed U-2 took over their role. The WB-57F also deserves a mention, as this was further modified by General Dynamics to be a dedicated recon platform. This included electronic reconnaissance specifically configured to gather data from Soviet missile tests, and 2 were operated by the Pakistan Air Force but under USAF control. They could also identify radiation from nuclear testing and record adversary communications. With an even larger wingspan of 122 feet, which is 16 more than the RB-57D that I just mentioned, it was able to reach and retain control at an incredible 80,000 feet apparently. Another major change was the J65 turbojets being replaced with Pratt & Whitney TF33 P11 turbofans. This gave it more than double the thrust of the B model, although turbofans were less effective at high altitude, so attached within pods under the wings were J60 P9 turbojets that were air-started and only used at high altitude where the turbofans were less effective. Remember that much of the turbofan's thrust comes from simply moving the air like a propeller, and with air being much thinner up there, it just doesn't work as well. These were later redesignated the WB-57Fs in March 1972, as the role was for weather reconnaissance, although it was probably a bit of a distraction from some of the covert work that they were still doing. NASA continues to use these as per 2026, in fact these are the only remaining airworthy examples. Of interest, the General Dynamics RB and WB-57Fs were so different to the original English Electric and Martin Canberras that they no longer had to be officially called the Canberra as per the building under license agreements. And when you look at them, it's no great surprise as only an avgeek could pick that they're siblings. But having said that, everyone still considers them as Canberras, even though they're technically not. In addition to high altitude and space research, the B-57 was used during the development of the Boeing CIM-10 bomber supersonic ramjet-powered long-range surface-to-air missile. This was used between 1959 and 1972, and you can see part of the missile attached to the nose here. These could be fitted with conventional or nuclear warheads. The B-57G also deserves a mention. The Americans were struggling to take out North Vietnamese supply lines that were operating at night, resulting in Operation Shed Light. The B-57s, which were in the process of being taken out of service, were decided to become the platform for this project. Westinghouse was given the contract to modify 16 B-57s to make the G model, which were fitted with forward-looking infrared cameras, low-level light television, and laser target designators, all positioned in a modified nose. These were capable of using laser-guided bombs during the day or at night, and this system was all operated by a guy in the second seat. As an experiment, they installed a single M61 20mm cannon inside the weapons bay under the Project Pave Gate. There were further delays in this program, and by this time the AC-130 had arrived, and that was deemed more suitable. It could loiter around looking for targets for many more hours than the B-57G and carry a whole lot more ammunition as well. In the end, the G model was removed from frontline service after only 18 months. Another slightly crazy idea was installing multiple downward-angled machine guns within the bomb bay, and these would saturate the ground with metal, as you can see in this footage. The AC-130's effectiveness made this whole idea obsolete, and the project was cancelled. In total, 403 B-57s were built, and the USAF retired theirs in 1983, while Pakistan flew them until 1985. NASA still operates several, and one was involved in the return of the Artemis II mission in April 2026. Now I'd love to make a similar video on the English Electric Canberra version, so if you've got a spare one, then please let me know. Thanks again to the SAC Museum, and if you're near Omaha, then please check them out, because without their generosity, I would not be able to bring you these videos. If you enjoyed the video, then please give it a thumbs up, and thank you very much for watching.